I can start by saying that this is the first time this subject is here in the course, and it's also the first time I ever speak about it. So I had to prepare for it when Gerd invited me. So you will see what came out of that. First I looked up what a hero is. That's a person who in the face of danger combats adversity through feats of ingenuity, bravery or strength. So the original hero of classical epics did such things for the sake of glory and honor. But modern heroes perform great deeds for the common good instead of the classical goal of pride and fame. This is from Wikipedia, and that's pretty good. To do something for other people is the strongest motivator I know about. To earn money is a poor motivator. As long as you can survive, it's fine. But to do something for other people really drives us, doesn't it? And that's Wikipedia a wonderful example of. Unpaid volunteers write Wikipedia. My view is that a hero is someone who has other genes than non-heroes. Why do I say that? Because I'm a biologist. During evolution, it's an advantage to stay in the middle, to not be a hero, but to stay in the middle so that your risk of dying becomes less. But then there are a few odd people like me who have something else in their genes, that we don't really think much about the risk for ourselves. We just do what we think is right. And this increases your risk of dying. So how did these genes survive during evolution? Well, I think it's because when a tribe comes under threat, great danger, these people in the middle, they don't know what to do. But then with these special genes, they take over and become leaders. And then you might get through the crisis. Can you see my point? It makes a lot of sense in evolutionary perspective that some people have these genes that make them vulnerable in ordinary life, but useful under circumstances of war or famine or whatever. So what is then a whistleblower? Well, that is someone who exposes any kind of information or activity that is deemed illegal, unethical, or not correct. And they take the risk of facing stiff reprisal and retaliation from those accused or alleged of wrongdoing. Again, this is in your genes, if you become a whistleblower or not. But of course, you can make a decision yourself, like Gerd actually said something about. We think we have some kind of free will, so we can do something. We can choose. Now, what is the fate of whistleblowers? That's pretty bad. Those who blew the whistle on fraud in healthcare, 90% were fired or demoted, 27% faced lawsuits, they had to seek psychiatric or physical care, suffered alcohol abuse, lost their homes, got divorced, attempted suicide, went bankrupt. And then what? Only 16% said they wouldn't blow the whistle again. Isn't that fantastic? Really fantastic. That must be in the genes when you are so foolish. Okay? So this is in Peter Rost's book, The Whistleblower, Confessions of a Healthcare Hitman. He was one of the directors in Pfizer, the big medical company. And he has written a wonderful book about how intelligent he was when he was up against a team of lawyers supporting one of the wealthiest companies in the world. He won. That's fantastic. So the book is interesting. Now, another article says that the cases take 5 years on average in healthcare when you blew the whistle against anything. This is very demanding on people. Now I come to something else. I usually tell chairman, I've not told Gerd about it, don't ever call me controversial. I'm pretty tired of that. Journalists call me controversial all the time. Why? It often means nothing else than to tell the truth. That's often unpopular in many places, particularly in healthcare. Of course, you can be controversial if you say nonsense, but often it's just telling the truth. And I have discovered that not many people are willing to be honest to themselves and to the world and tell people what they see. Does the emperor has any clothes, or is the emperor naked? My favorite, my best tale of all tales, by H.G. Andersen. So, you can ask, am I controversial? My counter question is, why don't people look at my credentials and arguments instead of calling me names? I'm the only Dane who has published over 70 papers in what we call the Big Five in healthcare: British Medical Journal, Lancet, JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, and Annals. There must be something wrong with that guy. How can he publish so much in the best journal we know about? He must be controversial. So it's usually about interests, money, or huge interests, which means a lot of money. That's what the world is about. And that's why people call you names. And why don't they discuss the facts? Because they know they will lose. That's my personal experience. So people avoid an honest academic debate. Instead, they revert to authority, defamation, and bullshit, which means something that is short of lying. Harry Frankfurt wrote a wonderful little book on bullshit that I can recommend. It's really good. He was a philosopher. Some of you have heard about it, it seems. Now I'll give you an example of bullshit. In 2011, I wrote a paper about Danish drug company Lundbeck because its director had said in a radio interview that antidepressant drugs protect children against suicide. What do? They cause suicide, which is why drug agencies all over the world tell people, perhaps you should not use these drugs for children, which I agree to. Now, Lundbeck's director said the opposite. So I wrote about this, and then the very next day, the research director of Lundbeck counter-argued what I had said, but he actually didn't counter-argue because his article was empty. So here is how he started out. We have, with regret, read Peter Gøtzsche's open letter, which unfortunately seems characterized by a limited professional insight into the complicated and extremely important issue of suicide and suicidal behavior associated with our pills in children and adolescents, and a possibly increased suicide risk in relation to treatment of depression with antidepressants. So actually, he here says the opposite of his director. In our view, any dialogue on this important topic should be evidence-based and not just take the form of a superficial polemic on an insufficient basis. This is a whole load of bullshit and bullshit words. That's pretty obvious. It's completely empty. And it's very close to lying because it was well documented what I had written, of course. Now, you need to choose yourself. And I have this from Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. I have his complete works I inherited from my great-grandfather. I have also studied Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. But Kierkegaard is much more important than the two others. Oh, he is. He's a great, great person. Read some of his, he's just amazing. So you need to decide which type of person you want to be. If you do not choose yourself, you will lose yourself. That's Søren Kierkegaard. You need to make up your mind. And I've also been inspired by Karen Blixen, a Danish writer. If your life has any value, it is that it has no value. Frei wer sterben kann. That means those who can die live freely. She wrote that in German, although she wrote the book in English, in Out of Africa. Now, we all have people who have inspired us, and one of my big inspirators was my grandfather, who participated in the resistance movement during the World War, was captured by Gestapo, and the worst torturer during the war in Denmark. He was Danish, and he was executed after the war. My grandfather escaped being tortured. He carried Jews in his doctor's car out to the coast where they were shipped to Sweden. So very few Jews from Denmark came to Germany and became exterminated there. So he ran a great risk. He also had weapons and was supposed to be involved in liquidation of a traitor. But the traitor, he disappeared before he was going to be shot. His companion had a cyanide capsule in his mouth when he was on these missions, so he could kill himself instantly, so he would not reveal his comrades. My stepfather was also taken by the Germans. They shot all of his comrades. He was the only one who survived. So I have a good deal of close experience from the war. My grandfather was sentenced to a concentration camp near Leipzig. And this is what was in store for him. The American troops took a 4-minute film when they came into this concentration camp. When the Americans were just outside Leipzig, the Germans in the camp, they lured the prisoners into a big building, poured an inflammable liquid over them, and put them on fire. And those who escaped were shot outside. Other people from the barracks who were very happy, they had heard the Americans were just outside the door. They rushed out of the barracks. They were shot dead on the spot, and some of them were executed on the barbed wire when they tried to escape. Barely anyone survived. So that is what my grandfather was expecting, but he was very lucky. The Allies had bombed the railways so heavily by the end of the war that they couldn't ship him to Leipzig to his certain death. So he ended up on the border with Germany, where he stayed till the liberation came. The reason I'm telling you this is that it means a lot to me, and it has a lot to do with heroes and freedom and fighting for freedom. And I visited Auschwitz in Poland in '81, and again 2 months ago, and also Birkenau. And I urge all of you to visit Auschwitz and to read books about it. This will mean something for you and for what course you will take in life. If somebody had taken Hitler down before he became a dictator and the history's worst mass murderer, we might not have had a Second World War. And when they tried to assassinate him many times, it was too late. He survived every time. So, and Germany, it's incredible that this can happen in such a civilized country as Germany. And this just tells us that evil is just below the surface. And we must combat it as soon as we see it, because if we wait, it might be too late. And the Germans are honest about their history, in contrast to Japan, that pretends that it doesn't exist, all their war crimes. So I think we should be very happy that Germany takes this stance and doesn't forget its history. The rest of us shouldn't forget it either. We saw it again in the Balkans during the Yugoslavian civil war. We also saw concentration camps. It will happen again. So that was a little about that. And another little story, I was I was on an expedition in Kenya in 1980 where the car broke down in the worst possible spot in a remote desert in northern Kenya. We had no idea when any other car would come by. The leader of the expedition was a mechanic and a previous United Nations soldier in Congo. He gave up when his car broke down. There was no leader. Then I took over the leadership immediately. Why? Because it's in my genes. I'm not a great leader. Actually, I'm a poor organizer. But I did organize the little group. So we survived. So that's just another example. And I wrote a book about it in Danish, because it was, many things happened during our visit to Kenya. It was fascinating. And we lost a lot of kilos. There was too little to eat there. Now, so a hero combats adversity through feats of ingenuity, bravery, or strength. And I think a whistleblower needs to possess all three qualities to survive. You have to be smart and able to think several steps ahead of your opponents, who, on the top of this, are rarely alone, but can often draw on a lot of money, legal and other expertise. So you are there all by yourself. So you have to consider very carefully what you do. And don't speak up too loudly and too convincingly when you're pretty junior. You may never make it to senior status. I was told that when I had made it to senior status, that if I had started like that in the beginning of my career, I would never have made a career. Ask clever questions and make people think. That's what Socrates did. And it cost him his life, as you know. You could ask in healthcare, how do we know that treatment A is better than treatment B? Should I try to look it up? For example, by searching in the Cochrane library that has systematic reviews on the benefits and harms of drugs? Then you are very kind to your professor. And you can come back and say, look what I found. I started this whistleblower journey, I think, with my thesis in 1990 called Bias in Double-Blind Trials, that summarized 6 of my papers. I had looked at 196 trials that compared one pain-killing drug, an arthritis drug, with another one. And one of the things I found was that bias in the conclusion or abstract consistently favored the control group in one report, and the new drug in 81 reports. That's 3 times 10 in minus 23. It was the lowest p-value ever reported in healthcare, and it was about bias. So my thesis actually was one of the reasons I became co-founder of the Cochrane collaboration 3 years later. Now, I also came in trouble in my own organization, Cochrane, and have come in trouble several times. I think the first time was in 2001, when we studied how good are Cochrane reviews. And well, we found some problems with Cochrane reviews. For example, there were problematic conclusions. The evidence did not fully support the conclusion in 9 reviews. That's 70%. And these problematic conclusions all gave too favorable a picture of the experimental intervention. So not even in Cochrane, where we try to be objective, do we escape this problem, because Cochrane reviews are made by humans. Now, we were kind enough to show the leadership in Cochrane our manuscript before we sent it to the British Medical Journal. That's probably the last time in my life I have ever done that. Never show anything to anybody, just publish. If you show things to people with an interest before, then you might even be threatened with litigation. For example, if it's the industry, just forget about it. Just publish what you think you have found. But we told the Cochrane leadership about it. And how did the leadership react? Oh, you should not show your dirty linen in public. I was summoned and stood there in front of a tribunal, 3 people. And it was very unpleasant. So I had to defend myself. So what did I say? I say, the whole idea with Cochrane is that we should be critical towards what people publish. Should we then not be self-critical? That will create respect. If we are not self-critical, we might fail. We might be an organization like anybody else where the protection of the organization is more important than helping the patients as honestly as we can. So I defended this and we published it, and there wasn't a big fuss about it. But it's just to tell you, don't show anybody anything in advance, okay? Then I have been heavily into research on mammography screening, and the bottom line is stop it. It's harmful. I have written so much about it and studied it so much in scientific papers, and I also wrote a book about it. And if you write in a book that some people have lied, then it's a good idea to have a large insurance against libel. Actually, I was asked to, if I had such an insurance before they published my book. But again, nothing happened because I didn't write anything that wasn't true and wasn't documented. Then we made a Cochrane review on mammography screening. And in my book, I have a chapter about that the publication of the Cochrane review was obstructed for 5 years. Why? Well, despite protracted negotiations, the Cochrane Breast Cancer Group denied us the possibility of publishing also the harms of screening, which are rates of mastectomy, tumorectomy, and radiotherapy. Although these were defined in the protocol the group had approved and published. You give healthy women a diagnosis of breast cancer they should never have had, and then you harm them by removing their breast or giving them radiotherapy or whatever. It's unavoidable. And we were not allowed to publish that. That was a bad moment in Cochrane's history. So they deleted it and said that we could publish the rest, and then they would think more about the harms. What did we do in that situation? We went to the Lancet. When Cochrane wouldn't publish our full review, then we hoped Lancet would, and Lancet did. They published everything at the same time that the Cochrane review came out, and editor-in-chief Richard Horton wrote that when we concluded in Lancet a year earlier that screening is unjustified, there was a storm of debate and criticism. And the editors of the Cochrane Breast Cancer Group later disowned us and our work, pointing out that our review was not a Cochrane review and had not been reviewed by Cochrane Breast Cancer Group editors. So what? It had been reviewed by Lancet editors. What's wrong with that? Irrelevant argument, isn't it? Now, and he goes on to say that the process of collaboration has broken down badly in the case of our overview, and the tensions indicate that even in the best organizations, raw evidence alone is sometimes insufficient to influence opinion. When we submitted our systematic review to the breast cancer group, our conclusions were unwelcome. But rather than supporting us, the Cochrane Breast Cancer Group editors insisted that changes which we disagreed with be made to the review if it was to be published in the Cochrane Library. There you have the explanation why I love nowadays publishing books, because people don't interfere with what I want to write. It's gorgeous. So I published this book in 2013 that had also appeared in German and many other languages, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare. A little before this, I had a paper in the British Medical Journal, here it is, which on the front page said, corporate crime in the pharmaceutical industry, is there a cure? That referred to my paper. I didn't call it corporate crime. I call it organized crime. So why didn't the BMJ call it organized crime? Because they're afraid of litigation and how much money that would cost. I was the first one in the world who called it organized crime. Although Pfizer had been convicted by a jury of organized crime, and although I could demonstrate that what Big Pharma does is organized crime according to US law, no one had used that word. Have I been sued? No. Why? Because they are smart. If they sue me, they would know that my books and everything I say will get even more attention. And they also knew I was right. So why sue me? Well, they could do it anyhow, but I would get more attention. So how was my book received in Denmark? Well, the president for the Organization of Danish Medical Societies wrote, "Evidence is one of the most noble concepts in the medical profession. This means that you have evidence to prove the claims you make. Professor Peter C. Gøtzsche violates strongly this principle in his book, which makes such outrageous claims about the medical profession as habitual criminals and the industry as a mafia, that it borders on dishonesty." That's really amazing. I have documented fraud and lies on page after page, and now I am accused of being dishonest because I've documented this. That's the art of always being right. And I have not written that doctors are habitual criminals. That's pure fantasy. And of course, I have evidenced what I say in the book very carefully. But he goes on to say that I discredit Danish doctors and my references are old and to a large extent from abroad. So we don't have crime in Denmark, only outside Denmark, right? Aren't the drug companies international? I thought so. It is deeply concerning that a person who calls himself an expert in the field has apparently not followed what has happened in the area over the past 20 years. Yes, I've just played golf and tennis. The Danish Association of the Pharmaceutical Industry came up with very similar arguments. So it's the art of always being right. So what I wrote back was, with over 900 references, my book is unusually well documented, and so are the crimes I describe. And it's grossly misleading to say that my documentation is old. The 10 cases I use to demonstrate that the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies have a business model that meets the criteria for organized crime are from 2007 to 2012. That was the year before my book was published. I do not think Schwartz has read my book, which came out the day before his condemnations. And if it had been as terrible as he says, it's hard to understand that a former editor of the British Medical Journal and an editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association happily accepted to write a foreword and praised my book in their forewords. And furthermore, the next year my book won first prize in the British Medical Association's Medical Book Awards. Highly commended, but of course it's all nonsense according to a person who has something he needs to defend. Now, a year later, I came in the fire again, because in a major Danish newspaper I described 10 myths in psychiatry which are very harmful for the patients. I ended my article by saying that I started it by saying many psychiatrists are well aware that the myths don't hold and have told me so, but they don't dare deviate from the official positions because of career concerns. Being a specialist in internal medicine, I don't risk ruining my career by incurring the professor's wrath. And I shall try here to come to the rescue of the many conscientious but oppressed psychiatrists and patients by listing the worst myths and explain why they are harmful. And then I ended my paper by saying psychotropic drugs can be useful sometimes for some patients, particularly in short-term use, in the acute situation, but after my studies, I have arrived at a very uncomfortable conclusion. our citizens would be far better off if we removed all the psychotropic drugs from the market, as doctors are unable to handle them. It is inescapable that their availability causes more harm than good. The doctors cannot handle the paradox that drugs that can be useful in short-term treatment are very harmful when used for years and create those diseases they were meant to alleviate, and even worse diseases. In the coming years, psychiatry should therefore do everything it can to treat as little as possible in as short time as possible, or not at all, with psychotropic drugs. That's pretty uncontroversial, I believe, but that's not what happened. Now, 2 months later, the Danish Psychiatric Association attempted character assassination on me. They wrote to the Cochrane leadership and quoted selectively, out of context, our citizens would be far better off if we removed all the psychotropic drugs from the market. And what did they ask? That they said I had been criticized by the Ministry of Health, the director of the National Board of Health, the director of the Danish Patients Association, the president of the Cancer Society, the president of the Danish Psychiatric Association, and the president of the Organization of Danish Medical Societies. This is persuasion by numbers and authority. Okay. They ended their letter by asking, how do you, with the specific knowledge you have on antipsychotics and antidepressants respectively, evaluate Peter Gøtzsche's statements as presented in his article? We would be very pleased if you would take up the task of making such an evaluation. Appeal to authority again. What does the mighty Cochrane collaboration think about me? What about the arguments? I was sitting here when all this happened, in a jungle, out of touch with anything or anybody, surrounded by spiders and crocodiles, they're called caimans down there, and all sorts of things. And there was a firestorm back home. But first, Cochrane's response was unfortunate. Cochrane is treating very seriously the points you raised concerning comments made by Professor Gøtzsche on the use of psychotropic medication. I want to state explicitly that these are not the views of the Cochrane collaboration on this issue, and we do not endorse them. It was signed not only by the CEO, but also by Editor-in-Chief and the 2 co-chairs of the Cochrane steering group. But since the letter said I, you may guess who wrote the letter. The views contained in this book are also not the views of Cochrane. I did not present views in my book, but a lot of facts, I think. And the psychiatrists had not referenced or referred to my book, so why mention it? Why should the Cochrane leadership denigrate my book, which people have been very happy about all over the world, particularly the patients, which the Cochrane is supposed to be there for? Now, the witch hunt was very horrible. The Danish conservative newspaper that broke the story seriously misrepresented the Cochrane letter. It wrote that I did not have support for a number of controversial statements about the drug industry and the use of psychiatric medicine, and that the organization doesn't agree either with the views I described in my book, where I compare the business model of the drug companies with criminal organizations. This was free fantasy, and I complained to the Cochrane leadership about it, and it later rejected what it had written before, or what was written in the newspaper. We have not at any time expressed any opinion about Gøtzsche's views about drug companies, but that was too late. They had denigrated my book. The damage was done, and the appeal to authority had worked, as it usually does. The letter from the Cochrane leadership proved to be a threat to what I had built up over 30 years, including my center, which is on government funding. The Ministry of Health declared publicly that my person and the center wasn't the same thing, which I and my senior researchers interpreted as meaning that I could be fired. Very weird, because I had done absolutely nothing wrong. I simply pointed out what I detailed in my book on psychiatry a year later, in 2015, and what many others have pointed out before me. So you have the 10 Commandments from Moses, "Thou shalt not criticize our drugs." The Lord's own drugs. So this is my psychiatry book that also has appeared in many languages, including German. And 500,000 Americans and Europeans, I estimated, had died in 2014 because of psychiatric drugs. I cannot know whether it was 500,000 or whether it was fewer, but it was many. I have made the best estimate I could. It's actually scary to see how journalists can distort their stories when they smell blood. The whole Danish press ran amok. And I wrote several articles, for example, one, how the Cochrane feather became 5 hens. That's another H.C. Andersen story. The rumors go around and suddenly the feather is 5 hens. I felt like the senator in ancient Rome who said that people wouldn't succeed stabbing him in the back, as he had so many scars already that the knife wouldn't get through. 10 months after the witch hunt, a BMJ paper with views very similar to mine appeared, but of course no one paid any attention to it. My academic career had already received a death sentence by the kangaroo court. The Danish drug industry is the biggest source of income in Denmark, so I run a certain risk by being critical in my country. Even we own more than on our pigs. We have 25 million pigs, we are just 5 million Danes. Now, I was invited to a debate at a psychiatric hospital in London. Do psychiatric drugs do more harm than good? And this was then a year later. A Danish newspaper wrote that the researcher reopens war. Psychiatric drugs kill thousands in an article in the BMJ. Appeal to authority and war rhetoric. Journalists love this instead of the substance. Then I was criticized by my Cochrane top colleagues again. But first, I wrote this in the BMJ, that we could stop 98% of psychotropic drug use without deleterious effects. And of course, this was challenged by a psychiatrist who failed to declare that he was on drug company payroll, which he was obliged to do. I had to tell the BMJ that he had hidden this when he wrote his views. And then a journalist who was absolutely certain that an antidepressant drug had helped him. An anecdote. But then I wrote in the BMJ that these trials have been conducted very poorly, so they cannot really evaluate the drug's effects. Almost all of them are biased because they include patients already taking another psychiatric drug, so when they get randomized to placebo, they go cold turkey, some of them, and often experience withdrawal symptoms, which can increase the risk of suicide and death. And then you conclude our drug is better than when we harm patients in the placebo group. Almost all psychiatric research is like this. And this research design has caused patients to commit suicide in trials of schizophrenia, 2 to 5 times as many suicides as when they are not put on placebo. This is very unethical research. Case for a whistleblower. Now, then the editor-in-chief in Cochrane and those responsible for mental health reviews in Cochrane, the depression group and the schizophrenia group and another group, they argued with me that recommendations in debate on psychiatric drugs are insufficiently justified. Well, I responded to them and said that the editor-in-chief is not a psychiatrist but Cochrane's deputy chief executive. Unsurprisingly, journalists and others have interpreted the Cochrane editor's denigration of my research as a thinly disguised attempt at protecting psychiatry's guilt interests. And some even suspect that they also tried to protect the drug industry. The editors rushed and published their rapid response the same day that my paper came out, a day before the Maudsley debate, the day even before I had debated. And their attack on the messenger was abused by psychiatrist Alan Young, who failed to declare his conflicts of interest in a bizarre way. I went on to say that the editors wrote that my recommendations are based on inappropriate interpretation of the research, which they cannot know because they haven't read my upcoming book that contains all the evidence. It came up a few months later. They also believe that researchers should not recommend a course of action. Do you agree on that? What about those who developed the nuclear bomb? They wrote a letter to governments warning against what it could lead to. I wrote, when doctors see colossal harm, they have a duty to inform the public about it. Psychiatric drugs kill more than 500,000 people every year in the Western world, and if we used only 2% of them, we could have healthier and longer-lived populations and would spare tens of millions of people from becoming mentally crippled because of the side effects. My interpretation of the science is shared by patients who disagree strongly with the psychiatrist about psychiatric drugs, which they dislike intensely and generally don't work. They say they don't work when asked their opinion in clinical trials and surveys. People believe that antidepressants, antipsychotics, electroshock, and admission to a psychiatric ward are more often harmful than beneficial. I agree, after having studied the evidence. We need a revolution in psychiatry and widespread withdrawal clinics because many patients have become dependent on these drugs and they need help to stop taking them slowly and safely. It's more difficult to withdraw people from several psychiatric drugs than to withdraw them from heroin. It's worse. Then I was asked to come up with an apology from the Cochrane leadership in no uncertain terms, that bad things would happen if I didn't. So I came up with an apology, as I did not intend to question my 4 Cochrane colleagues' integrity. I withdraw this statement to avoid any misunderstandings, and I apologize for any hurt and confusion caused. The fact is that all of us in Cochrane do our best to keep industry influence out of our work, which we regard as essential for the trustworthiness of our reviews. Well, you could argue, was an apology necessary? What I wrote was that actually several people saw this as an attempt at protecting psychiatry's guilt interests. Those psychiatrists who were editors in the Cochrane collaboration and other psychiatrists, people told me so, and I wrote about it. So I don't know whether I should have apologized, but I did. Now, the last 2 years, there have been many defamatory articles about me, around 20, a couple published in major Danish newspapers, and the rest in throwaway, web-based, industry-supported electronic journals. The main purpose, clearly, has been and still is to get me fired and to get my Nordic Cochrane Center closed by stripping it from the government budget. So questions have been asked to the minister. Neutral observers suspect that the drug industry is somehow involved in all this, and also even one of my tennis partners, after having read one of the newspaper articles, he said, that guy cannot possibly have written that himself. Someone else must have written it for him. Who was that? That is what we call ghost-written papers. I have documented more than 70 lies about my activities, and I have complained to the Danish Press Council and have taken contact with politicians in the Danish Parliament to tell them that these rumors aren't true and that the rumors of my death are somewhat exaggerated. This was Mark Twain, who read an obituary about himself and then said, that's somewhat exaggerated. Yes. Now, here is one example of one of these blunt lies. published by a journalist who doesn't really care whether it's true or not what he writes. He is the one who is behind more than 70 lies. He wrote recently, "The confusion of my private economy and the center's economy is worrying," or worse. What does it mean if it's worse than worrying? It means something I think is called embezzlement in English, isn't it? That you take the money, government money, for your own purpose. That's a pretty strong accusation, and as a journalist you need to have very good evidence in order to write like this. There is no such confusion. My hospital has made him aware of this fact more than once. Based on our ongoing administration and review of material in connection with inquiries from the Health Policy Journal, which is the one he edits, my hospital cannot recognize the journal's claim that a mix of private money, public funds, and research funds takes place. So my conclusion is, if you can't beat him, lie about him. That's also in the book, The Art of Always Being Right. As far as I can see, I haven't done anything wrong, but people out there in society that I meet, some of them walk around and think that I have taken some of this money for myself. Just tell a lie enough times and some people will believe in it. Joseph Goebbels from Nazi Germany was an expert in this. Others also know how to do it. So I haven't heard from the press council, but I talk to many journalists every week, and one of them is convinced that they must act. If they don't ask this editor to come up with a substantial apology, then the Danish Press Council have no reason for existing. It is so bad. I've never seen anything as bad in my whole life. And this is about me. So this tells you that if you get some influence, and if some people think that you have too much influence, you are a target all the year round. That's how life is. And you know the tune by ABBA? Money, money, money makes the world go round. It certainly does. Follow the money and you will find out a lot of things in our absurd world. So my final words are, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he has many fine sayings. And then a very famous quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men or women," this was a Catholic priest, I think, in Ireland, which is very conservative, so women didn't really count, is for good men or women to do nothing. This is incredibly important, and I hope that I have pushed some of you a little towards where I am. You don't need to go that far because that's pretty risky, but I'm still here, and I'm so old now that I mean, what can happen? I have the money I need, so they can't threaten my income or my career, or we'll see how it turns out. I'm in the middle of a huge battle right now that I even can't tell you about, that is one of the worst. So that was all. Thank you.